Anyway, good evening. Thank you very much for coming out on this New Year's Eve. So I wasn't expecting to do this, but yesterday I sort of cobbled together a few slides and been thinking about these things for a long time, God's providence in Britain. And Mike suggested I talk about it, so off we go. So potted. Anybody know what potted version is?
No, it's a new
It's not one that you fit in a flower pot, but it's...
Yes. Is it a shortened?
It's when you put
Condensed?
in a fish pot.
No,
Yeah.
it's not a condensed thing.
It's kind of...
Summary reading.
It's a mixture of a summary and leaving some. I mean, obviously you can't include everything, so you just include the sort of things one thinks is pertinent and for what one's doing, really. Anyway, so potted version of providential history, trying to understand how God has been working basically in British history and the things that went well, the things that didn't go well. And so I guess we should start off at the beginning. So the last ice age finished about 10,000 years ago. If you go to some of the islands in the very far north, as Shetland, you can find the remains of buildings that were pre the last ice age that survived because they're so incredibly strongly built, scarlet grey or something. And the last ice age retreated. People came over from Europe and settled down. Then the English Channel appeared as the ice melted even further, and Britain became separated from the rest of Europe about 6,500 BC. And then Britain has always somehow been self-identified or been identified by other peoples of Europe as being female. So this is Britannia, who symbolises Britain, and she is there with her sceptre, and there's always been like a female spirit. And then people living there at the time, we don't know anything about them really, except they built these incredible monuments, not just in Britain, but also in other parts of Europe as well. But the ones in Britain are the best surviving and the most impressive. This one's obviously Stonehenge, this one here is a similar one in Scotland. And then the Celts came over about 600 BC, and they settled, and they had their religion, they were Druids, and lots of Druid seminaries all over Britain, a huge centre of spirituality. It was also a place of resistance to the Roman Empire, and so the Romans weren't too thrilled with this. That's one of the reasons why they invaded Britain, to put down the Celtic resistance. And so personally I think Britain's always been the Eve nation, even at the time of Jesus. So there's these Glastonbury legends, you may be aware of, that Joseph of Arimathea, he was the person who buried Jesus, went to Pontius Pilate and said, "Can I take down Jesus' body and bury him in my tomb?" So you can only do that if you're a very close relative. So the tradition within the Christian church is that Joseph of Arimathea was actually Jesus' uncle. And that when Joseph the carpenter died, then Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus under his wing. And the tradition is that Joseph of Arimathea was an important figure, and he was a tin trader. And he used to come to Britain because in Cornwall was the centre of the tin production in Europe. And tin was necessary for making bronze. And so the tradition is that he came here with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, to Britain. And there are lots of legends around this place, and it's supposed to have built a place of worship. Then after the crucifixion, and Joseph himself, Joseph of Arimathea, the legend is that he came here, and he came to Glastonbury with 12 followers.
Wow.
And he brought his staff, and he went up this hill called Weariall, and he was very weary. And then he planted his staff in the ground, and the next morning it blossomed. And so this here is supposed to be, or understood to be, cuttings which came from that original staff that he planted. And the remarkable thing about this tree is it flowers twice a year. It flowers at Easter and at Christmas. And you don't find it anywhere else in Britain. It's just
Only in Glastonbury.
yes.
Interesting.
And then there was an abbey. Then the understanding is the first church in Britain was built there, very soon after the crucifixion, and then an abbey was built there. And then Henry VIII, who was a bit of a vandal, he went and yes,
Little bit.
yeah, really, it's a great act of cultural vandalism. until the Taliban, really. And he destroyed so many of these extraordinary buildings, temples.
That's St. Justin Roseland harbour
Uh-huh.
in Cornwall,
Yeah.
which is where the tin traders
Right.
came from Israel. It's
It's
called St. Just in Roseland. It's just near Falmouth.
If you look at the
That's where my sister lives.
if you look at the map of Cornwall,
Yes.
there's so many little towns and villages that are called named after saints, more than in anywhere else in the entire world. You just look at the map of Cornwall, not Devon or anywhere else in England, and just Cornwall, St. Just and St. Ives and St. this and St. that. I don't think this and that happen to be saints, but yeah, it's remarkable, really. The level of spirituality that was there. And this abbey was built, and it said there's a vast libraries and ancient documents that were kept in these kind of abbeys, and then Henry VIII and his thugs burned them down. That was called the Reformation. Anyway, so coming back to the crucifixion, so as it says in the Divine Principle, God's 2,000 years providence has prepared a democratic, social and legal environment which will protect Christ at the second advent. So that's a problem, because of the Roman occupation of Israel, then Jesus wasn't protected and he was executed as for trying to lead a political uprising. So God then wants to create that. So the question is, well, who is going to make a democratic, social, legal environment which will protect Christ at the second coming? So that's who's going to lay the foundation to receive the Messiah. The Messiah can be born, he can live, he can teach, do whatever he wants without being put to death. That's
You mean in the UK?
Well, it didn't have to be in the UK, it just so happens it was. But it should have been everywhere in the Christian world. I'm not going to look at all these different branches, but anyway. So if we look at the period of the church patriarchs, these were the Germanic tribes, the Huns, the Arabs, and this is the Roman Empire, the yellow bit, and these are the patriarchates. And then the Huns, everything comes in from the east, the Huns, the Mongols, and when these tribes move in from the east, everybody gets pushed along. So the Huns came along, and then they came 410, Attila the Hun decided to go to Rome, and the Germanic tribes, they got shoved along, and so the Angles and Saxons came to England. Celts weren't too thrilled, still aren't too thrilled about it, so they had to move north or west, and then the Anglo-Saxons then sent missionaries back to the Germanic tribes to Christianize Europe. And so as it says in the principle, God raised up Germanic tribes as a new chosen people. Because that's a failure of Rome. I'm not going to go into why Rome failed. Basically became a totalitarian state, and it was impossible for the Messiah to be born anywhere within the Roman Empire because there's no foundation to receive the Messiah because of the Nicene Creed. Anybody who disagreed with the Nicene Creed was a heretic and would be put to death. So God had to start from the Germanic tribes. And so the Germanic tribes, they invaded Britain. You got the Jutes, went down to Kent, men of Kent basically, the Angles and the Saxons, and that's why they're called Anglo-Saxon migration. So 410, because of the Huns coming in, so the Roman armies were withdrawn from Britain, and Britain was no longer protected by Rome. And as I said, that's just what was going on. Migrations, everybody getting pushed over. And so the Anglo-Saxons then, they settled in what's now called England, the land of the Angles. Thanks, David. That's great, thanks. And so they basically set up 7, I think it's called, heptarchy. Seven. Yeah, thank you for that. I've got a mathematician who's paying attention. So the heptarchy, there's 7 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And some of the names are still there. Essex, there's the East Saxons. Sussex is the South Saxons. Wessex is the West Saxons. And you've got East Anglia, because that's where the Angles were in the east, etc. And so if we look at the structure, it's very interesting. They were all freeholders. They were all had copyright, they all owned their own farm or their own piece of land. They lived in villages. There was a village moot, which is like a council, which governed the village. Every 100 villagers got together and elected somebody who could represent them at a higher level. They all have their own meetings and they're organised into shires, which is, still got the shires, the counties. There's something called the Wittengemot, which was the forerunner of Parliament, where representatives of 100 villages would come along and they would discuss things. There was a king, and the king, though, didn't have the authority to make laws. Only the law was customary, what we now call common law, is established by custom, and the king's job was not to make law, but to uphold the law and justice. Freedom was the watchword of the English. Freedom is an English word, doesn't exist in any other language anywhere.
Really?
Really.
I'm so pleased to hear that.
But do you know what it means?
Tell me, please. I'm
Okay.
looking forward to it.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, free means you can do anything you want. It's like liberty.
Yes.
There are no constraints.
Absolutely.
Free means you can do anything you want, no constraints.
Absolutely.
The word dom means law. Means
So do
law.
whatever you want within the law.
That's right.
Yes.
So that's why you
there's
get-
still freedom.
That's why Doomsday is Judgment Day. You get judged according to the dooms, the law. The Book of Dooms is the Book of Laws. And so Alfred the Great created this word. He's an Anglo-Saxon, good German. And so he was translating the Bible, and he couldn't find a word in English which conveyed the sense of the word in Hebrew or Greek. Hebrew, yeah. And so he cobbled together this new word, free and law. So freedom. No other language has that word. The idea of you're free within the law. You're not free, it's not anarchy, it's not liberty where you can do anything you want.
Which is what the bloody communists
You can do you can do anything you want as long as you don't break the law. That's it. And law, as I said, was customary, and there was trial by jury all the way back then. And so this is how it worked. The government of the English was derived from the customs of Germanic tribes. The English are a nation of freeholders living in homesteads. A group of these homesteads formed a village which had an assembly, the village moot, presided over by the village reeve. 100 or so villages constituted 100, which, like the village, also had a meeting presided over by an elder where they managed their own affairs. A number of hundreds formed a shire presided over by an alderman appointed by the king and the witan. The kingdom made up of these shires was ruled by the Wittengemot, the precursor of Parliament, and the king. The Wittengemot was the meeting of the wise men who could elect and depose the king if they didn't think he was fulfilling his job. Decide questions of war and peace, make and amend the laws, confirm the appointment of bishops and aldermen, and settle disputes. The king, being the descendant, was greatly respected. He's supposed to be a descendant of Woden, God, anyway, never mind. But could not alter the law, levy a tax, or make a grant of land without the consent of the Wittengemot. His main responsibility was to lead the army in war. You read this, you think, wow, that's amazing.
Yes.
Wish our country was like that.
What era?
This is the Anglo-Saxon,
What year?
5th century, 6th century, up until the Norman conquest. This is how England was governed. Incredibly decentralised, incredibly democratic, and free with freedom. Anyway, after the Huns, then it was the Vikings' turn. They sort of multiplied and expanded and went all over the place. And yeah, and so they also came to England. And they invaded England. They destroyed basically their thugs.
So they destroyed.
They destroyed this incredible place in Lindisfarne, somewhere over here. This incredibly beautiful gospel was written there, and also the Book of Kells, Iona. Anyway, so they occupied basically half of England, this whole pink area here, and it's called Danelaw because their law was the law that applied there. And there's a lot of fighting, and the Vikings are very good fighters, and the English were getting driven further and further to the west. And, they got killed, a lot of the kings. Anyway, Alfred the Great then became the king of Wessex, and he was the one who was supposed to burn the cakes. You know that story? He basically is a refugee, and he went to stay with this old lady, living in the marshes somewhere, I think it was. Anyway, she said, "Can you watch my cakes while I?" And he said, "Yes, of course I'll watch the cakes." Anyway, he was too busy thinking about the Vikings that his cakes got burnt, and that story went down in history. But anyway, while he was doing all this thinking, he found out that the Vikings who were wintering somewhere over here on Salisbury Plain, then they found out that that's where they were. So he thought, I'm going to go incognito and see how they're getting on, what's going on in the Viking camp, army camp. So he dressed up as a minstrel, he could play a musical instrument, and he went there and he was entertaining them. And at the same time, he realised that he made friends with I can't remember what the prince was called, and at the same time, he realised they didn't have much in the way of food stocks. So he left the camp, he raised an army, because everything was dispersed, raised an army, laid siege to the Viking camp, and he starved them. And eventually, the Vikings said, we want to surrender. And then Alfred, all his warriors, they said, right, now let's go and massacre them and put them all to death. But Alfred, who's a Christian, said, no, we're not going to do that. And he went in and he spoke to the prince of the Vikings with whom he'd made friends and said, look, if you and your Viking army are baptized, we'll allow you to stay in England. Because he realized we can't drive them out, so the only thing to do is to integrate them and assimilate them and to convert them to Christianity. And so that's why, although Scotland and Wales are like that, England is not divided into two. It's one nation, because the Anglo-Saxons converted Vikings to Christianity, so they all developed the sense of being English Christians. And so, yeah, the whole Viking army was baptized, and they were allocated pieces of land where they could live undisturbed, and that's the way it developed. So that's why Alfred is called the Great, because he had this mind, being a good Christian king. He translated the Bible into English, parts of it, and he coined this word, freedom, and he created the beginnings of the Navy, amongst other things. Okay, so that's the way England was developing, but then the Norman conquest came. So Edward the Confessor, he was the last English king. He died childless, because people said, well, he's too much of a saint to have produced an heir to the throne, so that was a real problem. Then Witten, they elected Harold, who was the Earl of Wessex, to become the new king. But then William, who's the Duke of Normandy, the Normans were descended from the Vikings, then he decided he wanted to conquer England. So he got together a band of warriors, and he wanted to go and conquer England, because England was incredibly wealthy. And they got the Pope to agree, and the Pope agreed and gave him the authority to go along and become the King of England. And so this showed up, and then it's all recorded here in the Bayeux Tapestry, woven by English seamstresses who were very talented. It showed the weakness of this decentralized Germanic system. They weren't able to defeat William the Conqueror, who, with his militaristic, disciplined army of knights.
What happened to the Bayeux Tapestry, you said?
It's in France.
Yes, I know, but what is it in the...
Okay, it's a long tapestry. It's very, very long.
Yes,
It
I've seen
easily
it.
goes around this room.
Mhm.
And it was woven by English weavers.
English weavers?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah, there was a huge amount of skill.
yes.
No.
Mhm.
Anyway, so England then was attacked by two armies. One was Harald Hardrada from Norway, who was a Viking descendant, connected to King Canute, I think, and then this Harold defeated him and then had to march south at the Battle of Hastings, and was defeated by the Normans. So there's on this hill, Senelak, I think it's called, and then the Normans attacked up the hill with their knights, but they couldn't get to the top of the hill. All the English there were around with their shields protecting, holding the fort there. Then the Normans withdrew, and then the English thought they were in retreat. While retreat, then the English just ran down the hill, and then the Normans turned around and slaughtered them, killed them, and Harold was apparently shot by an arrow in the eye. Anyway, this has gone down as one of the greatest lessons of English military history. That when you're on the hill, you stay there. You don't chase after the people. So as a result, he became the conqueror. What does that mean? means he conquered England, and then all the land became the property of the crown. All the whole of England, all the land actually is the property of the crown.
Still,
Till today, that's the legal basis. You might think you have the freehold, but underneath that freehold is the crown owns everything, which is why the crown has the authority to go and requisition any piece of land it wants. So that's what happened during the Second World War. You know, the military wanted this or this and this, so they had the authority to go and take this and this and this and this, because underneath the freehold was the crown that still owns it till today. There's also the introduction of feudalism, the aristocracy. You know, instead of this democratic society of equals, you ended up with this feudal society. You've got the king, and you've got the earls, the dukes, and the earls, and the barons, etc. It's a very hierarchical aristocratic society was imposed. And then the king then, within the conquer, would allocate pieces of land to people, but it never to look after on his behalf. But it never actually ended up belonging to them. Because underneath there's this kind of crown ownership. And for 200 years then, the English were ruled by the French. French was the language of all the ruling class for 200 years. It's a long time.
here in the UK,
In England, the ruling class, the monarch and all the
spoke
aristocrats,
French.
they were all Norman. All the English landowners were dispossessed. They were thrown off their land. They were made to become peasants. And over them were put all these Normans, who were the serfs. That happened here, and worse to come as well. All the castles you see, Tower of London, Windsor Castle, all these castles are built by the Normans, because these are places where the Normans would have to live. Otherwise, if they went out of their castle, they might get their throats slit. That's Robin Hood. He was fighting against the Norman.
So they were pushed out?
No, they were just
killed?
they were just dispossessed. The English were just dispossessed.
All right.
All their land, their farms, everything were just taken away. They no longer had ownership. They no longer had any political or social rights anymore.
No wonder why the French and the English don't like each other.
Anyway, never mind. we got over it. I'm just saying, you know, English people generally, we never talk about these things.
But they don't know.
We don't know. What's the point?
That's
Instead,
right.
you
They
know,
don't know
perpetuating, you know, these bad feelings, etc. That's just the reality. You know, we look at these nice castles, tourists go visit them, but we try and understand, well, why was the castle built? That's the reason, to dominate and control that whole piece of land. And so the militaristic expansion then went into Wales and into Scotland and also into Ireland. The Normans were very militaristic. Anyway, they composed the Doomsday Book. So this is a record of every single piece of land in England, every single cow, every single dog, every single house, everything, for tax purposes. So the very fact it was possible to create such a record of every piece of land, every house, every cow in the whole country just shows you how well organised the English system of government was. It's very decentralised, but extraordinarily well organised and ordered, such that William the Conqueror could give this an order, and that all the officials were there to be able to carry this out and compose such a document. Anyway, this is the sort of thing. So some people, they weren't too pleased with this. So, especially in the north, they were revolted. The William's men burnt whole villages and slaughtered the inhabitants. Food stores and livestock were destroyed, so that anyone surviving the initial massacre would succumb to starvation over the winter. The survivors were reduced to cannibalism. Not very long ago, it's only 1,000 years. In 1086, Yorkshire and the North Riding still had large areas of waste territory. The Doomsday Book entries indicate Wastes est, it is wasted. For estate after estate, these are estates, lands owned by the English. In all, a total of 60% of all holdings were wasted. They've burnt down. Houses are destroyed. Everything was destroyed. People just left to starve. So it's all recorded in this book, what happened. Even the prosperous areas of the county, this is the north, has lost 60% of its value compared to 1066. Only 25% of the population and plough teams remained, with a reported loss of 80,000 oxen, 150,000 people, William's men sorted the land to make it infertile.
Why, you said England was wealthy.
Yes.
What was the source of the wealth?
Wealth was all kinds of things. Well, first of all, it was very decentralized. It's basically a free market. If you've got a free market, you're much wealthier.
Absolutely.
That's the first thing. So there's agriculture. In Cornwall, it was the mining centre of the whole of Europe. Cornwall was, until recently, 100 years ago, a lot of gold, tin, all kinds of precious, valuable metals were mined in Cornwall. And anyway, lots of other things, the source of wealth. Anyway, so that was just the complete eradication of the Anglo-Saxon heritage. The attempt to eradicate God's providence, which had moved to the Germanic tribes. So what do? You start to recover these things. So in 1164, the church then, which was controlled from Rome, it came under the law of the land. That meant Thomas of Becket was put to death because he was trying to stop the church being under the law and stop murderers who were clerics or monks or priests who committed murder. Then they would be let off because they were judged by church law, which meant you could be forgiven, whereas regular people were hanged. Then brought back trial by jury. And then there was a king called King John, anybody read 1066 and all that will know is a bad king. And so he didn't want to be governed by law. He said, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want. And he really annoyed people, by this. And so the barons, they gathered together at Runnymede, which is near Windsor, and they said to him, look, if you don't keep the law, we're going to throw you in the river. And so basically he signed this, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Rights. The rights to be able to go into the forest and do hunting, the right to do this, right not to do that, etc., etc. Such as this, no person should be imprisoned, deprived of his property or outlawed, but by the judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This is the guarantor of freedom. That meant that just because you annoy the king, your king can't put you to death or put you to prison or confiscate your land just because you've annoyed him or he wants to do that. You can only be punished if you've broken the law. And it's not the king that decides if you've broken the law. That is decided by your equals, not by some official of the state or the government or the king, but by your equals and the law of the land.
I believe that happens only in the UK.
Sorry?
I believe that happens only in the UK.
Well, that's where it started. It's this attempt to try and recover the biblical tradition that so inspired Alfred the Great and the Anglo-Saxons. Anyway, gradually, it's a long haul to try to recover that kind of thing. 1258, 3 parliaments a year, and the king has to act with advice. It's established the king cannot behave like a dictator. He cannot act arbitrarily. He cannot do something just because he wants to do it, even if he's the king. He has to act with advice. So he has to listen to the advice before he makes a decision, and he has to basically follow the consensus. And then 1265, the House of Commons was established. So the first parliament, this is just of the barons and the aristocrats, that's what's now called the House of Lords. And then later on, the House of Commons was established, where people who were knights, for example, could go, and if you're wealthy enough, you could be involved with that. And the 1297, the first complete parliament, was established by the king on the principle it was right that what concerned all should be approved by all. 13th century. If it's going to affect everybody, everybody should be involved in the decision-making process. Yeah, it's amazing. 13th century. So they're gradually trying to recover the principles of the Germanic tribes, which is where God's providence moved. And authority of Parliament develops. So then it got to the point where both houses of Parliament needed to change the law. So you couldn't, one House of Parliament by itself couldn't do it. You had to have a consensus of the whole country to be able to create or to change a law. Then you have this conflict between Henry VIII and the Pope. Henry VIII had a daughter, Mary. He felt, and Catherine Aragon, who was a Spanish princess who he married, who he loved very much, but she wasn't able to bear any more children and didn't have a son. And Henry VIII felt without a son, then England's going to descend into a civil war. Because there was the War of the Roses 100 years before, where the House of York and the House of Lancaster were fighting over who should be the king, who should have come from the House of York or the House of Lancaster. And Henry VIII felt if there isn't a strong king, then again it might descend into that. Anyway, so he had a big argument with the Pope. Eventually he decided any solution is for the Church of England is to separate from the authority of Rome. There's some laws are passed so that the Pope had no authority in England anymore, established the Church of England, made himself the head of the Church of England. It wasn't a Protestant Reformation, it was entirely structural. Everything remained the same in terms of doctrine, structure and everything. The only difference was instead of the Pope being at the top, it was the king. And then he organised his own divorce. So that was the important thing. The fact that he has 6 wives, honestly, it's neither here nor there. Unfortunately, at school, they study all the trivial things. Important things are not studied. Henry VIII was really important, but not for having 6 wives. Anyway, so the English religious conflict then came about. So after Henry died, then his son, Edward something or other,
Second.
was it? Oh, no, not the second. It's more than the second. 3rd or 4th, maybe the 4th. Anyway, whatever. Anyway, I can't remember. Sorry.
Was that before the roses?
No, this is afterwards. The Wars of Roses was
Okay,
over here.
good. So it's after.
Yeah.
So maybe said well.
And so Edward then, after Henry VIII died, and Edward became the king as a young boy. His mother was Anne Boleyn, who was a Protestant, so he was brought up as a Protestant. And so when he became the king, he wanted to make England Protestant. But he died quite young. And so his sister then, so the crown then passed to his sister Mary.
I think he was the son of Jane Seymour, actually, and then Anne Boleyn, wasn't it?
No, he was the son of Anne Boleyn. No, you're right. Yep, sorry, Anne Seymour. Yeah, it's Elizabeth who's the daughter of Anne. Thank you for paying attention.
Yeah, I like history.
Okay, all right, so that's right. Yeah, Edward was the son. Yeah, okay, it's Anne Seymour. Anyway, so Mary then, who was the daughter of Catherine Arran, was a very devout Catholic. And then she married the King of Spain, which upset a lot of people, because that meant that England then would come under Spanish control. And the Protestants then, they were persecuted. Quite a lot went to Switzerland, to Calvin's Geneva, or to Holland, and they became even more Protestant. Anyway, so she died childless, and then her sister Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, she was an Anglican, which she was Protestant, but not radically Protestant. So she was an Anglican. Her vision was to create a Church of England in which everybody went to church, but she didn't care what they believed. So she said, I have no desire to make windows into men's souls. So I don't mind if you believe in the transubstantiation of the Mass. I don't mind if you think it's entirely symbolic. Just turn up. And whatever you're thinking, whatever you believe, I'm not interested. I just want you to turn up. So the only qualification for being a member of the Church of England is to be English and to like tea and biscuits.
The sherry.
And sherry, of course. Anyway, so she was trying to create this very broad church, as the Church of England still is. There's a Catholic wing and there's a very evangelical wing. It's very broad. And that was her, which I thought that was remarkable. You know, she didn't care what people believed. She didn't institute heretic counting because she saw how miserable it would be persecuting the Catholics, persecuting the Protestants. You know, the country can't go on with this kind of religious conflict. We have to just tolerate each other. So that was her vision there. Anyway, so she refused to marry this King of Spain, you know, as her sister had done. So the Spanish were not happy, and so they had the Spanish Armada try to invade England and make England Catholic again. And then they were destroyed by a huge storm. generally speaking, in England, God votes with the weather. So, you know, the huge storm destroyed the Spanish Armada. You know, during D-Day, you know, well, during the Dunkirk, English Channel was like a milk pond, all these little boats could go and rescue people. And then, of course, you know, during the Brexit vote, it rained incredibly heavily in London and lots of voting stations were closed. Anyway, so things developed. Then Elizabeth herself, she died childless. So the question is, well, who's going to become the next monarch? The English and Scots have been fighting a lot. And this Elizabeth's advisor, I've forgotten his name now, he came up with this idea, well, what about inviting the King of Scotland, who was obviously a cousin, to become the King of England and Scotland, and he can unite the two crowns. And so James VI of Scotland was invited to become James I of England. And anyway, during the 17th century was about, I'll talk more about that later. And then, okay, so, oh yes, okay, so when Elizabeth then became the Queen, then a lot of these Protestants from Calvin, Geneva, from Holland, they came to England, and they were being radicalized, so they didn't want to have bishops. They just wanted to have a Presbyterian style of, church government. And they're very, very radical Protestants. And Queen Elizabeth was very much against that, because she said no bishop, no king. So she wanted, you know, to maintain the Catholic structure, so the Catholics would be happy because they still had bishops and there was still communion and this, and basic liturgy was very Catholic, but at the same time, you know, it was Protestant. They're trying to find a middle way. But the radical Protestants weren't satisfied with this. They were pushing to make the Church of England more Presbyterian and much more Protestant. Anyway, so they got persecuted, and so these radical Protestants, you know, they went to Holland and eventually went off to America. And because they wanted to elect ministers instead of bishops appointing priests, they wanted to be able to elect them. It's a bit too far for that time. And I totally agree with what she did. Persecution of Puritans was the right thing to do at that time because they were trying to go too far. And England was just trying to fight for its life against other Catholic countries. Anyway, so they went to America, and then, you know, along with this, round about the sort of time was developed the slave trade, started to develop British, English, I think, slave traders started taking slaves, people from Africa over to the Caribbean and also to the Americas. And then 1621, freedom of speech was established in Parliament. Then in Parliament you could say anything you wanted, complete freedom of speech. You could criticise the king and you wouldn't be arrested and punished. And then the petition of right, that no man can be taxed without consent. That the idea of no taxation without representation was established in England. And then the English people who went to America took this up as a sort of banner. Anyway, while all this was going on, there was the English cultural renaissance developed. There was Sir Thomas More, he wrote a book called Utopia, which I'm not terribly thrilled with myself. There's Sir Walter Raleigh, who was an explorer and a very cultured person. Christopher Marlowe wrote a book called Dr. Faustus, and of course, the greatest of the writers at this time was William Shakespeare, who wrote a lot of political plays and also a lot of sonnets and things, and poetry. This is one which is interesting. He wrote lots of love poetry. This is a particularly interesting one. Coral is pink, nice. Coral is far more red. He's writing here about his wife. Oh, anyway. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her black breasts are dun grey? If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that comes from my mistress' reeks. In other words, she's ugly and she's got bad breath. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go, my mistress when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with force compare. In other words, it doesn't matter. The reality is my wife is incredibly ugly, she smells and this and this and this, but nobody loves her as much as I do. Isn't that nice? It's interesting.
I'm not going to quote that.
I just thought, he's known for a lot of love poetry, sort of familiar kind, but I thought this is an interesting sonnet. It's just a very different dimension.
Where do you get, reading that, where do you get from
Well,
that he really loves her? Because
oh yeah,
that's
okay.
not-
From that concluding lines.
And the final line is like the,
Tell me, please.
okay,
It's
and
important.
yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare, nobody else would love this person
Like I do.
despite all of this, as any sheep alive with force compare. So, yeah, that's the point. Despite all of this, he really loves her with his whole heart.
Well, I guess that's the time of poetry. I mean, the Shakespearean poetry is
Yeah.
what,
Well,
1500s?
this is Shakespeare, yeah.
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think anybody would write like that in the 21st century.
It's
They're not good enough.
it's just a sentiment. It's really, it's unconditional love. That's what it is. That's what he's presenting here, unconditional love. I'm not evaluating and judging her by what she looks like on the outside or anything like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course.
So I think it's a poem that should be better known,
Yeah.
because this is an example of unconditional love.
Sonnet, I never heard it before, so
No,
I'm
no.
sorry, but I have to take it. I like it.
130, yeah. So that's interesting. So
Oh, William, I value this so much.
that's
I
a-
didn't expect this today. Yeah, it's so much learning. Thank you.
So that's the sort of thing that was going on
No,
at
yeah,
that
but I
time.
didn't expect it.
I mean, you can see, you read his poems, anyway, the expression of the Christian culture of the time comes through very, very
Shakespeare.
profoundly. And you read the political plays, they're brilliant. Every kind of character is there. If you want to study politics, it's better to read Shakespearean political plays than anything else. And then there's Marlowe, Edmund Spenser wrote about the Fairy Queen, John Milton, Paradise Lost, which is an incredible poem about the Bible and the fall and creation, everything. And John Donne, this is quite a well-known poem. No man is an island, entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. I think there's an incredible sentiment. We're all family. If somebody dies, it's not a stranger. This is part of my family. Yeah. So all this kind of incredible Christian biblical sentiments are expressed through this kind of poetry. That's just one of many. So it's like an expression. This is what English, Christian culture was like at that time. Recovering the way that it was after, from before the Norman conquest. So there's the English Civil War. Okay, so Charles I then. Okay, so James then, he came from Scotland. In Scotland, they didn't have this English tradition, and so a Scottish king was pretty powerful. The Scottish Parliament was very weak, whereas the English Parliament was always very strong, right from the very beginning, and the king had to listen to the Parliament. James, who came from Scotland, he was always very uncomfortable with the English Parliament. Then his son, I think it was Charles I, again, he grew up spent quite a bit of time in France, where they had, Louis the whatever, who said, the state is me. And again, the States General in France are very, very weak. French Parliament is very, very weak compared to the English Parliament. So he developed this idea he inherited this idea of the divine right of kings. So he thought that he didn't have to obey the law. He was above the law. And he thought he had the right to make laws. And to tax people without getting permission from Parliament. The English Parliament didn't like this, they were really upset. And so the result of that, he dissolved Parliament, because only the king is able to call Parliament and dissolve Parliament till today. And then he ruled personal rule for 11 years like a dictator. But he ran out of money. He couldn't tax people because it was established a long time before that only Parliament was able to raise taxes. So he ran out of money. So he started imposing various kind of giving away monopolies and trying to find ways to impose, money collecting things. Eventually he ran out of money. But also, he was a high Anglican. As I said, he was, sort of the high end of Anglicanism, almost like a Catholic. Because of his own background. Anyway, so he sought to impose the Book of Common Prayer, which was the English prayer book on Scotland. Now, how stupid a move is that? So the Scots I've got mentioned, they were Presbyterian. The Church of Scotland is not Anglican, it's not Catholic, it's very, very strongly Protestant and Presbyterian. And the main reformer there was someone called John Knox. Anyway, so he's tried to impose the English Anglican Book of Common Prayer on the Scots. The Scots said, no way. They all gathered together, formed like a sort of pact, a covenant together, National Covenant it was called, and they invaded England. Charles couldn't defend the country because he had no money to raise an army. So the only way to raise an army was to get money. The only way to get money was to recall Parliament. So he recalled Parliament and then dissolved it the same year because they'd been out of, they hadn't been sitting for 11 years and they were really annoyed with the king. And then the Scottish Covenant, as I said, they invaded England. And then Parliament then was recalled again because they needed to get the money. And then Parliament decided to impeach the royal officials. So the people, Stafford, for example, who were basically the henchmen of the king, Parliament impeached them, put them on trial. And then you can imagine then that King wasn't happy with this. There's also the abolition of the Star Chamber, which was something where you could try people, find them guilty without them breaking the law. It was trying to bypass the courts. And anyway, so then Parliament refused to go along with it. So the king then, he left Parliament and he went and put his standard, and there was a civil war from 1642 between king and Parliament. And Parliament then was, anyway, the Cavaliers following Charles were defeated, and Charles was beheaded in 1649. So then you had what appeared what's called the Commonwealth, the Republic.
In those days,
What?
In those days,
Yeah.
which you just referred to, what kind of relationship did English and the French have? Was that peaceful or
At this
still
time?
conflicted?
Well, by this stage, England no longer had any land in France that had been lost. So England, the reason why there's a lot of conflict between England and France for hundreds of years was it was, the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror, but William the Conqueror was a Duke of Normandy. So because he's a Duke of Normandy, all of Normandy was his personal possession. So that when he died, all the kings who came afterwards, they were also Dukes of Normandy. They had huge possessions in France. And then the French wanted them back. And so there's a big fight as the French defeated the English and recovered all the possessions that had been inherited, passed on from William the Conqueror.
Yeah, but in those days, the land in England,
Yeah,
which was...
no, the French, England had already been driven out of France by this stage. And we've got lots of glorious memories of Agincourt and Cressay, but I didn't want to bring them up. Poitiers. Waterloo came later. Anyway, this is just a joke. When this train running into this express train from France to London,
Mhm.
The
Wait
first,
until Waterloo. Absolutely.
it first came into Waterloo.
Completely rude.
Okay, so all the French people arrived at the state, got off the train station at Waterloo Station.
Yes.
And they were-
anymore.
They were really upset.
Yeah.
You know, how offensive could you possibly be?
Oh,
And-
that's why it was moved
It'd always
to
been
King's
called. It'd always been
Cross.
called Waterloo Station.
Oh my God, I'm wondering.
Anyway, and so the English said, "Well, what else would you like us to call it? Cressay, Agincourt, Poitiers."
I know.
And the English are meant to be diplomats.
Pardon?
The English are supposed to be diplomatic.
Anyway, it's always going to be a temporary thing, but they weren't going to change the name of Waterloo Station to something else just to satisfy the French.
Oh, it's a city in Belgium, Waterloo.
Yeah, I know, the battle was, but it was the French that were beaten Napoleon,
Napoleon.
yeah. That's why we named it after a piece of Belgium.
Why is it called Napoleon? I didn't understand why is it called Waterloo here.
Because it's a great battle. It's just to commemorate this
And
great
it
battle.
was under Napoleon?
Yes,
Yes, there was the time that
that's when
But
Wellington.
that's later, that's not that.
That's
Napoleon
much
was-
later. Yeah. That's much later.
It's much later, 200
1850.
years almost.
1815.
That-
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a modern bad joke.
I said this is the potted history. Okay, so England then became a republic. There's no king, and then Oliver Cromwell, who was a parliamentarian, Protestant from Norfolk, and then where many of the Protestants and Puritans came from, who went to America, and so he was became what's called the Lord Protector, and for about 10 years, and he didn't do anything. It's remarkable. There's no parliament because the parliament is incredibly lots of arguments in parliament. They're always fighting with each other, you know, and so he said.
they still do.
Yeah, I know, but it was even worse then. And so, okay, so he cancelled Parliament, and then there's a rule by army. So what's interesting with Oliver Cromwell, he's basically a dictator.
Is it?
Well, I mean, in my country, in history, he was a bad man.
I know.
When I came to Britain, I didn't know what to believe because they praised Oliver Cromwell like a point man.
Okay,
So I thought, where am I now?
okay, he's an interesting character.
Of course, you're French.
He's an interesting character. He became a dictator,
Yeah.
but a very interesting kind of dictator.
Criminal anyway.
Okay, so I'll give you an example.
He killed many people.
What the point was, the reason why they wanted to cut their king's head off because of the divine right of kings. They didn't want somebody going around not observing the law, thinking they're above the law. So Cromwell said, no, we have to be governed by law. And so he appointed someone called, to be a chief justice, you know, the top judge. I can't remember his name now.
Kill the Catholic, you know.
Sorry?
Kill the Catholic. Kill all the Catholic.
No, not at all.
Or he did.
That was just a
They
second.
killed, he was really against Catholic.
I'm not saying he wasn't.
Oh, wow, very.
I didn't explain to you why. Okay, I'll come back to that why. Okay, so he appointed the Chief Justice, and he said to this very eminent judge, who's the most respected judge in the country, will you be the Chief Justice? And the Chief Justice said, I don't acknowledge your authority to appoint me. And Cromwell said, I don't care what you think. I just want you to apply the laws of the land. So Cromwell didn't want to invent new laws. He didn't want to create new laws. He just wanted the laws of the land to be applied. That was all. And he didn't care whether the Chief Justice acknowledged his authority or not. Just, you know, you apply the law. I thought, okay, that's an interesting kind of dictator. He didn't amass vast amounts of wealth for himself. If you want to go back, okay, so this whole thing going on between the Catholics and the Protestants, as I said, you know, Britain basically under Elizabeth became Protestant. But then the Catholics in Spain particularly very upset, so there's the Spanish Armada, and then the Pope said it's the duty of every Catholic living in England to try and assassinate the King or the Queen. And so there are many, many plots to try and assassinate Queen Elizabeth. Then there are many, many plots to assassinate James I, you know, the sixth, James I. So James I, who came from Scotland, he published a new version of the Bible. The King James Version was established by him. Then in 1605, there was a plot, the gunpowder plot, to blow up the Houses of Parliament while the king was there. So this is a plot of Catholics, Guy Fawkes and quite a lot of other Catholics, who were all Catholics. You know, following what the Pope said, it's your duty to overthrow the king and to make England a Catholic country again. So that's what was going on here. So for a long time, even till today, Catholics are not allowed to hold certain offices in the land. Because the question was, are you loyal to the Pope or are you loyal to the king? That was always the question. And so as long as they're loyal to the king, it wasn't an issue. But when they start, so this went on. So, you know, in 1605 that was going on, and it's still going on, you know, a long time later. Things didn't get resolved until the 19th century in this respect. Anyway, so Oliver Cromwell then, he also went to Ireland, and the Irish don't like him very much because he defeated the Irish army, settled Scots in Northern Ireland. Because basically the whole of Europe then was convulsed by this Protestant Catholic war, which went on for 140 years, till 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia. So all that's going on here is what Oliver Cromwell did his bit in terms of trying to maintain Britain as a Protestant country, which, yes, involved killing Catholics who, whatever. But still there are lots of Catholics around.
That's why you don't like the Catholics.
I'm not saying that. I'm quite happy with Catholics as long as they don't try to make Britain a Catholic country. That's the whole point. So the Duke of Norfolk, who's the most senior Duke, you know, apart from the ones that were royal dukes, the Duke of Norfolk, the most senior Duke in England, he's a Catholic. But he's loyal to, he and, you know, they were always loyal to the king. So that was never an issue. It's when people were disloyal and wanted to get involved in some kind of plot, which was treason, gunpowder treason plot. Anyways, Oliver Cromwell then, he's a very controversial figure in England as well. Nobody knows where he's buried. They couldn't bury him because he was going to get dug up and burnt. Nobody wanted that. So for hundreds of years since he died, 1660, his head was never buried.
Oh, where is it then?
He got passed around by people who liked him.
Oh, good.
And then,
His head.
no,
So did they prepare it or did something to it?
well,
Because normally those things rot anyway.
yeah, he got the skull. Anyway, so eventually, in the 20th century, the college in Cambridge, where he went to college, he's a graduate of it, said, we'll take his body.
And they're still there.
Yes, except nobody knows where.
Ah.
But yeah, so the Cambridge College where he went to Cambridge, they said, yeah, he's a graduate of our college, so we will take responsibility for him. In the 20th century.
Wow.
So yeah, Cromwell also is an incredibly controversial person here.
So it's
Because he dissolved Parliament, so people said he wasn't democratic. We hate him. Never mind what he did in Ireland. And ruled by army, so he's a dictator, you know. So it's a very controversial figure here as well. But, you know, when you look at it in terms of, in hindsight, what he did for England was a good thing. That's all I can say.
But so he doesn't have a family? He's not now.
Okay, so he died, and then he wanted his son to become the next Lord Protector. But his son didn't want the job. So that's interesting. Normally, people want to bet. You know, if you got offered the opportunity of becoming the ruler of the whole country, you think, yeah, I want that. But he wasn't, Oliver Cromwell himself wasn't interested in it. He was only doing it because somebody had to do it. He thought maybe my son can take on the job when I die, but his son wasn't interested either. And so when Cromwell died, basically Britain was left rulerless. And people were wondering, well, what should we do? And so, anyway. So at this time, there's also a lot of religious reform took place. During the Civil War, there was the Church of England lost its authority. Basically, Act of Uniformity was abolished, which meant you had to go to the Church of England. And the Church of England Episcopate was abolished, became Presbyterian. So all the things the Puritans wanted to happen to the Church of England happened. But also there's a huge outpouring of religious fervour. Huge amount of religious fervour at this time. So there were groups, because society became, there was no longer any authority of the church to impose authority of belief and anything else upon people. And so you had groups called the Ranters, the Fifth Monarchists, the Seekers, the Mugglepolians, the Quakers. So the only one that's still around in large numbers are the Quakers. But, you know, and they're completely, we don't want a bishop, we don't want a minister, we don't want anything, we just want to be a society of friends. We sit down in a circle as society of friends, and, you know, when we feel the Holy Spirit guiding us, then we'll speak.
They still exist to some
Well, they
extent.
do. I know that they do. What I'm saying is there were dozens of these sects and cults. Dozens of them. Some were radical communists who wanted to share everything in common. There were all kinds of different people. Because there was complete religious freedom at this time, the 17th century, because the power of the established church was broken. And the power of there was no king. There was no parliament to impose order. So anybody could set up any kind of little religious group they wanted. So you have practical religious freedom. And there's also free thinking and speaking. There's something called the Putney debates, where there's a church in Putney where they thought, okay, what are we going to do? You know, the king is dead. How shall England be governed? So that you can read the transcripts that every single kind of political opinion, from anarchy to totalitarianism, was expressed and they argued for. And they just argued and argued for a long, long time. And there was complete freedom of speech and freedom of ideas. And they just arguing. And then at that point, Cromwell realised, we're never going to get a consensus. So let's just close it down and we'll just be governed by law and just have no parliament passing new laws. So you realise, you know, there's so much controversy, so much dissent, you realise never going to come to any kind of conclusion. And then you have other people like this. John Milton was at this time, John Bunyan, Pilgrim's Progress, and lots of others, you know, involved in this whole discussion.
You know, there's a museum in John Bunyan. I'd like to visit it.
Where is it?
Anyway, so
Yeah.
how are we doing? Oh my gosh.
Do you want to take a break?
Yes.
Yes.
Anyway, and then